The topic for discussion today is China-India relations, roles of media and business. Ambassador Pillai will chair the session, and I hand over the floor.
Once again, this is the second part of today's program, and that is the panel discussion. I thought they would have distributed. What I can do is just give you one liner, because they're quite extensive. All of them are very good panelists and rather long background. But I will just mention what they do and then let their contribution and the discussion speak for their background. I will give each one of them about 5 to 6 minutes, and then we will have about 45 minutes or so of discussion, question and answers. You can direct the question to a specific person or just to the whole panel. On my left is Professor Cheng. He's the director of EAI. He's one of those that we collaborate very closely with and one with whom we have a very good relationship. Then you have on the same this thing, we have it's all jumbled up here. Professor Rigby from ANU China Institute, Australian National University. Then next to him is Professor Shen Di Li from Fudan University, School of International Affairs. And then Vikram Khanna probably doesn't need introduction in the Singapore audience. He's the Associate Editor of Business Times. Then on my right, I've got Simon Long, the columnist from Economist. And then of course, our lady participant, Professor Yu-Shi Chow. Professor Chow is from Vancouver, Canada. Actually, I will try and see whether we can distribute the full background of these people, all the panelists, so that you can have a little bit more insight. But I don't want to take up too much time reading the CVs. So let me start with, as always, ladies first. So may I start with you?
What a surprise and what an honor. Okay, well, it's really a great pleasure and a privilege to come here and to share my thoughts with you. It was just being said that China and India relations is it's the most important in Asia. Coming from Canada, and I would like to argue that if not now, in the future, I think China-India relation will be the most important relation in the whole world. If not just by any other reason, but just by the virtue of the fact that these are the world's most populous nations, but also two great peoples that has a very long history of sharing ideas with each other and neighbors. So in that sense, I think it's tremendously important for these two nations to understand more towards each other. Not only that, I think also it was just mentioned that there's an information gap, but I think this is more than just a gap. I think in light of the current cut-neck economic competition, it's very easy for these two nations to develop into tensions. It was just during the discussion earlier today, a point was made, or observation was made that the Indian press was only interested in Chinese defense budget, and it has no interest whatsoever in other parts of the Chinese national budget. So it's very easy in the current cutthroat international market competition for these two countries to see each other as enemies. And for me, as a Canadian, also Chinese, the worst thing I want to say is to see these two countries run an arms race. And also, not only just arms race, actually, it was also said, because of the pursuit of the kind of economic development model that the two countries actually already now were racing for minerals, right? That's another form of competition race. At the same time, historically, like what I said earlier, these two peoples have a shared history of trying to pursue ways of development that, in the Indian context, it's called, or Chinese context too, self-reliant, right? And we know that that model is no longer sustainable. That's why the two countries both open up to integrate with the global system. But right now, this global system is really in crisis, and I don't need to elaborate more. So not only these two countries were at this stage, I think, facing great challenges, but also at a crossroad in terms of thinking, even leading humanity in terms of thinking, what are the alternative ways of development, surpass the current, if I will, put it, a kind of consumer capitalist ways of development. Because the general idea we learn from the West is that if you just jump into the market, then you will create a middle class, and then a prosperous middle class will, ensure stability. But I don't know how the India situation fared, but in China actually, just before the middle class was big enough, they are facing a tremendous stress, for example, because of the housing problem. We're not having a middle class. People say, being white collar is really a low class. You can't even buy houses anymore, so you become an ant nation, i.e. people live like ants in the cities. So there's that tremendous challenge, and I think these two nations at this point have, in addition to practical means of more business exchange, I think needs to think beyond the box and to draw into the tremendous cultural resources, wisdoms these two countries have to think for humanity, really, ways to overcome current problems, challenges, and think in terms of longer-term development models that will truly ensure justice, equality, dignity, those ideas that both nations share. But at the same time, I realize there are tremendous challenges. For one, there's always, the divide and conquer strategy from the part of the great powers. And, that information gap that was just referred to, I think, is very much historical legacy. Also, we still, and I think it was discussed earlier in the morning, this theme come up again and again. That is, we still tend to see each other through the eyes of the West. So a kind of, orientalized ways of look at each other. And also in the current context of economic recession, some people talk about, the long stagnation or that kind of thing. Although these two countries have experienced tremendous development, but like what I just said earlier, there is bottlenecks. There are bottlenecks. And in this kind of situation, where you have tremendous social tensions domestically, it is very easy to point finger at the other and to create enemies. So when there are domestic problems, create an external enemy. So right now, I think in both countries there's that danger. And now speaking of the press, the media I think have a tremendous role to play in either leading what I mentioned earlier, rethinking of the current world order and, draw from the cultural imaginations of the two great nations, peoples, and their long traditions to think beyond the box, or go to the sensationalist road to, dig into the most chauvinistic part of nationalism, and then to create environment for war. And I think the media in this way, in this sense, have a tremendous role to play. And what's important, interesting is, throughout the discussion today in the morning, both countries, both observers from two countries point to the existence of that kind of sensationalism, that kind of common denominator, appeal to the lowest common denominator approach. So how to overcome that? I think there's a challenge. Of course, journalists are individuals, sometimes there's not much you can do, but I think there's still agency. Even though the commercial logic, the media system in India is much more open, much freer. The Chinese system is much closed, but also with the development of the internet, with the development of a commercial sector within the Chinese state-controlled media system, there's that tendency there as well. And I think journalists individually also, I think we have a tremendous sense of responsibility, and of course, scholars too. Really? I thought it's a long time, so I will stop.
Yes, okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Professor Chow. You see, I was one of those who went through the university looking at things through the British eyes, because we had lecturers from Britain. We were very much Britain-oriented. And the magazine that I used to subscribe was a leftist magazine called The New Statesman. Mr. John Freeman, I think, was the editor, and then Paul Johnson. Then one of my birthdays, somebody subscribed, paid 1 year's subscription for something called The Economist. And that I must have been about 19 years old. And since then, till today, I've always read The Economist. I've stopped subscribing for New Statesman. I'm sorry about that, but so we have now a representative from The Economist, Mr. Simon Long, and to give his view of this subject, the role of media and business in India-China relations. Mr. Simon Long. You can use
Thank you very much, Ambassador, for your kind introduction and for continuing to subscribe. Please keep it up. Don't switch to the cheaper digital iPad version. I've got a chance of staying in work if you keep on the print edition. It's very daunting to speak in front of such a distinguished audience. I don't think I will need 5 minutes to say what I'm going to say. I am the eyes of the Western media through which India and China look at each other. And so, as you can see, I'm by definition a distorting prism, which is a point that has been made a number of times today in the discussions earlier on, that Western media coverage fosters suspicion and is unhelpful in India-China relations. And I suppose it would add fuel to that argument when I say that I completely agree with Professor Zhao about that the India-China relationship is probably the defining one of the 21st century. And when I say that we so believe in it that The Economist put that on our cover a couple of years ago, but as I recall it, the cover line was contest of the century, not friendship of the century or alliance of the century or partnership of the century, but contest. And I think it was a picture of two arms arm wrestling. For the sake of full disclosure, I have to say I actually wrote that cover leader, so I suppose I had better justify myself. China-India relations strike me as an enormous puzzle. On the one hand, as we have heard, economic relations are booming at a phenomenal rate. The expansion in trade over the past decade has been extraordinary. On the other hand, particularly in Delhi, there is a continuing sense of almost isolation from India. The direct flights are increasing, but when I was there, it was incredibly difficult to find a direct flight from Delhi to Beijing, for example. Only a couple of weeks, so it was an Ethiopian Airlines one and another. There were very few experts from China. There were very few think tanks specializing in China, though that was beginning to change. And within the defense establishment, both think tanks, the army itself, and within government itself, there was a deep-rooted suspicion of China. This seemed to be odd at the time when economic relations were doing so well, and the war was 50 years old. And the agreement to set the border dispute to one side was over 20 years old. Why was there this lingering suspicion? And in many ways, I think since I was in Delhi, which was in the earliest of the century, 2002 to 2006, I think in many ways since then, things have actually worsened. Yet it seemed to me that surely for China, there can be no greater interest in South Asian policy than maintaining good relations or establishing good relations with China. It's by far the most important country strategically, politically, and economically in the region. China's historic alliance with Pakistan is a problem, but it's one that surely Beijing has a greater interest in good relations with India than with Pakistan. Similarly, on the other way around, doesn't India have an enormous stake in good relations with China? So it's again the major growing economy. It's now, as we've heard, India's biggest single trading partner. Both sides surely have a great stake in getting on well. And yet, I recall a lunch given by the Ministry of Economic Affairs ahead of a visit by, I think it might have been to India. And the theme of this lunch was to brief foreign correspondents such as myself on how India-China relations had turned a page. Things were much better now. We could now move on, establish proper good relations. And it's been spinning this line for an hour and a half or so, quite convincingly. And I happened to ask then, what do you think then China might start supporting India's bid for permanent seat on the UN Security Council? And the instinctive, immediate reaction from one of the Joint Secretaries present was, oh no, China will never go India a seat at the top 10. So don't take this seriously. And that, in a forum whose intention was designed to be the opposite, that seemed to me quite revealing. From China's point of view, it would surely be concerning that around its region, from South Korea, whose biggest single trading partner is China, to Japan, whose biggest single trading partner is China, all the way around to India, you have this historically, to me, it's an unprecedented situation where booming economic ties, economic integration in cases between these countries, is not accompanied by any form of security link. And on the contrary, in the case of South Korea and Japan, is accompanied by a strengthening of security ties with a third party, the one with whom economic ties are getting weaker, with America. So, moving on to the role of the media, Western media may play a minor, unhelpful role in furthering these suspicions, but it appears to me that it is only a minor role, and that there is something fundamental in perceptions in India about China that China needs to work on changing, and maybe there is something fundamental in China's attitude to India that also needs work. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Alan Long. Next one is my neighbor, Professor Chan from EAI.
Thank you, Ambassador. First of all, I would like to take this opportunity to congratulate Dr. Amitadu Palit, a good friend of mine, a moderate man, for this wonderful book. And I think he had enough courage to write a book on China-India. I tried many years ago in early 1950 when I was a student at Princeton, because one of my supervisors is an Indian scholar, Atokoli. So I told him, I tried to write a thesis, a PhD thesis, comparing China and India. But eventually I gave up. I found those two countries are too big for me to handle. So, but eventually, I admire Amitadu very much to produce such a wonderful book about China and India. Because I think due to globalization in the past decades, and lots of new terms and have been created, like China, Chindia, or Chinamerica. Well, lots of terms. Well, many people say, well, all those terms are very idealistic, But somehow I believe, that this kind of term, I think it has caught the training, general trained, whether American, China, America, or China, India. And economic interdependency matters. Of course, economic interdependence did not prevent war, for example, before the World War I in Europe. But today, economic globalization and the economic interdependency does matter. And because dependency creates a lot of stakeholders in both sides of, for example, the Pacific Oceans, or the two sides of the Himalaya. So every time when I go to China, Guangzhou, Shanghai, Beijing, I saw more and more Indian businessmen in China. And the flight between Shanghai and New Delhi are always full. So I think it's a good side. Also, the education side, a lot of people now, because sometimes the government is not so trustful. People-to-people's interaction is more important than G2G. This is a good side. Somehow I would say, and China, India, of course, because the two growing powers, and so far, and of course, the lack of mutual trust is kind of obvious. But they are also there's no institutional mechanism for those two powers to interact, interplay, to build mutual confidence and trust. But somehow I think some sort of institutions are coming. For example, the China side, is thinking about, or China-Russia at least, this Shanghai cooperation organizations, when this organization can bring both India and Pakistan, as a regular members. So for China side also, is quite eager to establish a regular summit or high-level talks with India, because this bilateral relation is so important. But of course, if we look at the media, because this idea about the media, and if we look at the media only, then people will feel, wow, and a lot of bad things between China and India. But as the media sometimes is very problematic, even in China, like Professor Zhao mentioned, and the Chinese media still is a controlled wing. But under this tightly controlled system, I think it is quite a high degree of liberalization. I just came back from China. It's very interesting to find out, of course, for example, Guangdong, media in Guangdong, media Guangdong, of course, you cannot criticize something, within provinces, but they are able to criticize what happened, in other part of China. Well, for central media, Beijing control media, well, of course, they can criticize every province first. Then also they can criticize other countries. So that I would say, in some sense, Chinese media are not very much commercial, interest-driven. So no one can control the media. No one control media. Can control media. Of course, some sensitive areas, I would say yes, and the propaganda department is still able to exert control. But this is very what I call selective control, really selective control. And for even the Chinese media system is very interesting, actually. Well, India, of course, is a free media. Everyone can say whatever they want to say. But so it's the same thing now in China happening, particularly in terms of foreign affairs, foreign relations. In the past few years, you can see, this even different sectors of Chinese society has been quite vocal, high profile, lots of voices, complaints about the government, like currently about the Filipinos and this South China Sea issues. Lots of media is going on. But that, the media side, besides media, I also a bit worried about what I call the Americanization of China's ISAS studies. I feel, to a degree, that's also true in India, in terms of if you look at those the workers or papers produced by scholars in the field of strategic studies, and China and American, actually China and India, they're following those scholars are following the same logic, the American logic. So I worry about, I always say, in this century, the worst thing for IAR is China become another America, or India become another America. Despite, of course, this democracy or freedom, but China, if China becomes America, it's the worst scenario. Last time, I give a talk, a speech to the NUS. I would say, actually, people, well, in India, a lot of people talk about the political regime matters because India is democracy, China is an authoritarian system. My argument is different. As long as Chinese is Chinese, the regime doesn't matter. If the Chinese can follow their cultural logic, China will be a peaceful nation. If China becomes American, then China will become very aggressive. Even China become a democracy, right? I think this is China and India, two big civilizations. If educated sector, right, scholarly community can find something from their own civilizations, that will make this the world more peaceful. Don't learn too much from America. That's my conclusion.
Thank you, Professor Chen. Now I call on Professor Rigby to give his presentation.
Well, thank you very much. I shall be relatively brief because I think most of what needs to be said has already been said very well, which is not to say that these two gentlemen don't also have very good things to say, but as the sandwich, I'll try to make it filling rather thin, not too intellectually thin, but in terms of time. Okay, we're supposed to be talking about media and business, the roles of the China-India relationship. And of course, a relationship is more than a business, it's more than media, although they both do play an important role. Economics are obviously crucial. We wouldn't be thinking about China in the way in which we do were it not for the absolutely stunning progress, in some ways mysterious, as Professor Wang always pointed out, but the stunning economic progress that China has made over the last 20 or 30 years. And similarly, so much of the attention now focused on India dates back to India's own beginnings of opening and reform, and the very serious and impressive first steps that have been taken over the last decade and a half, at least. But having said that, just as man does not live by bread alone, and so countries' relationships are not formed on economics alone. Education, culture, science and technology, people-to-people relationships, so on and so forth. And of course, crucially, and this has already been touched on by two of the previous speakers, there is the strategic and security aspect of the relationship. And it's just a fact that as the economy of China has grown, so has the awareness of the strategic and security implications of this become increasingly a factor in the way in which we think about things, the way in which we think about China. You know, only 10 or 15 years ago, diplomats from virtually every country I can think of would troop off to Beijing and say how happy they were at the prospect of a strong and powerful and wealthy China, but probably not thinking it was going to happen quite so soon. It was a little bit like St. Augustine, you know, Lord, please make me chaste, but not just yet. But China has become wealthy and powerful more quickly, I think, than many people expected, including many people in China. And I think this poses problems for China as well in terms of how it deals with this long-sought goal of wealth and power. Of course, there are many parts of China which are neither yet wealthy or powerful, but overall, it is now closer to those goals which we can trace back at least to the 1860s than it has ever been before. And so there is a sense of discomfort now, even in those countries such as my own, which would be in a terrible mess were it not for China's economic success. you know, in Australia we like to congratulate ourselves on the way in which we've come relatively unscathed through the GST. There is one reason for that, and that is China. Of course, we also say this, we made wise decisions and implemented important reforms of the financial system and so on, which were true, but without China, I'm absolutely certain that we would not be anything like as comfortable as we are, which is not to say that we don't have plenty of problems. But in recent years, it seems in Australia we've had almost two separate discussions about China. We've had the continuing economic discussion, and we've had the strategic, the security discussion. And although there are some people in government and one or two of my academic colleagues who try honourably to try to bridge this gap, by and large, there are these two distinct discussions going on in the media and elsewhere. And whenever I go to Delhi and elsewhere in India, and I try to visit India as often as I can, I'm equally struck by the disconnect between what's happening in terms of the economic relationship and the way in which the relationship is discussed in strategic and indeed military terms. Now, Simon's already spoken a good deal about that, so I won't go any further. The question arises, well, what about business and what about media? What sort of a role are they playing? If there is a disconnect to be bridged, how is this working? In terms of business, I think business probably does what it can, but sometimes business tries to avoid being too overtly political and prefer just to get on with the serious business of making money. With the media can play a good role, and it can play a role which is sometimes quite negative. But having said that, I think we need to be very careful about any sense of trying to guide the media into more positive ways of reporting. In the end, the media will report on what it considers to be newsworthy. I think more important is ensuring that the media is as well informed as it can possibly be, so that Chinese journalists who write about India know a great deal about India, that Indian journalists who write about China know a great deal about China. I mean, this goes globally, but today we're talking about India and China. And in order to bring this about, they need to be educated. Now, you know, most journalists, particularly foreign correspondents, tend to be pretty well educated people anyway, but there's always a role for more education. One of the things that we've been trying to do in this newly established Centre on China in the World at the ANU is to try to tailor courses which fit not only the needs of policymakers, but also of media and of business. You know, we had a rather rocky bilateral couple of years with China a few years back, 2008, 2009, and it struck some of us that there was a huge need for just a better informed debate and discussion. And I think this goes equally, if not more so in some ways, for India and for China. Now, while I would like to be able to say that we at the ANU would be perfectly prepared to play this role, I think actually this really needs to be done in China and it needs to be done in India. And a lot of effort, I think, needs to be put into the Indian side, into building more comprehensive think tanks and educational institutions looking at China. China has got a long way to go too, although I think it's marginally ahead of India, but only marginally. But until that comes about, I don't think there's anywhere else in the world which can play this role better than Singapore. And I'm not just saying this because we're guests here today of ISAS-EAI, but Singapore does seem to be is better placed than just about anybody to play this crucial role of helping India and China to understand one another better. Now there's much more to say, but I think I'll leave it there.
Thank you. The next speaker will be Professor Shen-Ding Li from Fudan University.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Let me first congratulate my girlfriend, Amit Tendo's latest book. Warm congratulations. I have been made acquaintance with Amit Tendo for the last 2 years. I feel I'm so lucky to know you as a friend. Your scholarship and your personality
make me to feel happy. I try to introduce your book to more Chinese readership and hopefully someday there will be a Chinese translation of it. Over the years, there has been a phenomenal development of Chinese economy. China GDP at official exchange rate was 48% as US last year. And there's also a phenomenon of Indians' rapid rise. And even better, there is a phenomenon of the co-rise of China and Indian economy. That's very rare, and that's happening to our satisfaction. But meantime, China is only producing some 10% of the world GDP, actually 11%. And China, India putting together probably 12-13% of the world total GDP. Far less than the percentage of China, Indian population putting together. That's 36% of the world population. So still there is a big road to go to fill the gap. Two great civilizations and no reason to lag behind. That 36% of the world population produce 13% of the world wealth. There are many ways to fix this. I believe we will be able to fix. One, the possible solution is to build trust between China and many other countries, including US, India, Japan, Vietnam, Philippines, etc. Therefore, we would save our money for our poor people. To buy stuff from other countries to make our people happy and also to create a job for other countries. And also, no matter what they would do on China, we would forge their external environment with which they would be better able to save their money, defense money, for their own economy. Don't wait for others to create environment for us. We can create it for them. In 1994, when I first applied Indian visa in New York, I was denied. The reason was we don't issue visa to people from unfriendly countries. So I asked the visa officer, could you repeat that China is an unfriendly country? She said yes. I thought I need to complain. Roger complained to the Indian ambassador to the US. And they should issue a letter of apology to me. Because officially Indian government did not state at that time that China is an unfriendly country. But I think fundamentally we, Chinese, should ponder why this lady, as a government official, would deviate her country's policy. Absolutely, she was wrong. She committed a mistake. She could think this way. She should not speak that way, that morning. I would presume one of her family members probably lost his or her life in the 1962 border clash. And China would have its own national narrative that we deserve to do this. We are on the defensive side. And India's national narrative could be on the other side, that China did not deserve to do this, and India has its national narrative. So I need to sit where Indian shoe to think why she would say this, and how I and my descendants and my country, my government, should shape India not to think that way in the future. Not just to blame them, why you say this, to help them not to think similarly at the future time. I can help. I have been helping for the last 20 years plus. I think India has this Gujarat doctrine, which it does not apply to China and Pakistan, which states give and without taking, but for Bangladesh, Nepal, Maldives, Sri Lanka, etc. For smaller country, I think it's good. It's moral. When China would think we are a bigger country, bigger than India in terms of size of territory and population, with other factors, why we should not have a Chinese version of Gujarat doctrine, give without taking. And we may shape India to include China into its version of Gujarat doctrine, if China would do it first. Don't wait for India to do first, as we are bigger. Bigger, you first should have a bigger heart, tolerate self-criticism, and observing what Confucius has stated, don't do upon others what you don't want others to do upon myself. And if we can often think this way, to be humble and to be respectful, I think China and India will be able to build one of the best partnerships in the world. True, China-US relationship might be the best, most important bilateral relationship for China, if not for the US. But what should, in my view, shall be the China-India relationship shall be China's most important bilateral relationship for now and for the future, and for the humanity. If these two people putting together 36% of population will trust each other, the world will be largely peaceful, and we will be able to condition the US when the US would deviate from international law in its recent handling in Iraq. We'll be able to help the US not to commit its mistake. If we love the US, we need to tell it. So there's a big hope. I congratulate Amitandu for producing your book, and we should deliberate how the two countries can grow peacefully at the same time, dispelling our distrust. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Shen. As always, I like to have Singapore to have the last word. So I have my friend Vikram Khanna as the last speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. Hello, everybody. Amit, first of all, congratulations. Any book that fills this vast information gap between two countries that are going to form the defining relationship of the 21st century is worth its weight in gold. And it's wonderful that you've done something like this and that we have a seminar like this. But let me speak as a media person, primarily. Professor Zhao and others have talked about how we need to be responsible, and I agree. I mean, we often tell our journalists that, but don't bet your bottom dollar that it's going to happen. First of all, there's a dispute over the meaning of the word, what is responsible. Second, we live in the information age, we live in the internet age. You're not only dealing with professional journalists, you're dealing with citizen journalism as well. People are going to give their views, and what the dice are going to fall as they may. And I think you have to be ready for that. But that said, I think on media, what's important in the China-India context, I think, is how the governments and the business community use the media in each other's countries. And I think that is something that really hasn't happened. The Indian business and the Indian government has not figured out how to use the Chinese media, as far as I can see. And the Chinese government and Chinese business has not figured out how to use the Indian media. Part of the problem, of course, is language. The common language between China and India is English. And the English media is a minority in both countries. That is a problem, but I don't think that's the only problem. I think media exposure, to a large extent, is a function of the degree of overall engagement between two countries on many fronts. It's not just an economic story. I think, as Professor Ricky mentioned, it's not just business. And the problem, one of the big problems with India and China is their lack of engagement on multiple fronts other than trade. Even on trade, I mean, let's remember that a lot of the trade, the composition of trade, is raw materials, capital goods, and commoditized manufacturers, and not brands. I mean, it is brands that create understanding, curiosity, and admiration in a way that iron ore or cotton yarn or factory machinery can never do. So I think that is something that still has to happen. But another reflection of the lack of engagement is what you see on the investment side. The cumulative investment, Chinese investment into India as of the end of last year is $575 million US, which is really paltry. And the cumulative Indian investment into China is less than 450 million US, which in the scheme of things is pathetic. It's very, very small. You see it in the lack of dearth of cultural connection. Well, yes, there is a revival of Buddhism in China, but the Indian connection there is known but not widely appreciated. Buddhism is also not as prominent in India today as it used to be. There are some Indian cultural events in China occasionally, and Chinese events in India, but by and large the cultural footprint in either country of the other one is very small. You see the lack of people-to-people contact. I think Professor Zhang mentioned the importance of people-to-people contact. Chinese families and Indian families do not have family members working, living, or studying in the other country the way they do in Europe or the United States or Australia or even Singapore. I think this is a factor. And even among academics, I really wonder what the depths of contacts are. I suspect it doesn't go very far beyond specialized institutions, and it's a very fledgling process. You see it in tourism as well. India draws less than 100,000 Chinese tourists a year. Singapore manages to draw 15 times that amount, 1.5 million last year. China manages to do much better on tourism. It draws in 500,000 Indians a year, but Singapore again, a city, is able to more than double that. For Indian visitors to Singapore, it's about double what they are to China. Of course, all these things are starting from a low base, and I think Simon had mentioned there are problems with flights. You don't get not many direct flights. In fact, Air India cancelled its Bombay-Shanghai flight because they just did not take us. Okay, that's the origins of the lack of engagement, the lack of the gap that we're talking about. Those are some of the factors there. Let me look at the bright side. I mean, even though I'm a media person, I must confess, I have less faith in the media than I have in popular culture. And I think I have less faith in politicians, I have less faith in even business than I have in popular culture. And it's very encouraging here that the Chinese government's official film production company has given us backing to produce a full-length Bollywood movie. It's called Goldstruck. It's about a Chinese and Indian student in America who meet up and then they go on to have an adventure in both their countries. And it's going to be a huge Bollywood production, directed by the Hong Kong director Tony Leung. And it's going to be probably released, I think, either toward the end of this year or next year. I think these things are important. The producers of the movie, the Chinese producers of the movie, want to make this the biggest hit since Raj Kapoor. Raj Kapoor, by the way, for those who may not know him, was a big movie star in the 1960s and 70s in India. And he was a huge movie star, hero in China. At that time, also Russia. At that time, Indian films were allowed in China because Western films were considered bourgeois and sort of, too liberal or whatever. Anyway, he went on to be a huge star. So there are movies like Caravan, Shri 420, and Awara, which were Miralam Joker, which were huge hits in China. And the older Chinese people, I don't know if there's any of you among them, but they remember him vividly and they even sing his songs even today. So anyway, they want to bring about a revival of this. And I see more hope in things like this. Interestingly, the
the yoga guru, the Indian yoga guru, Mr. P.K.S. Iyengar, he wrote these famous books on yoga. Light on Yoga was his classic. He wrote many others. China held its first ever yoga summit last year. And he was there as a speech speaker. He was astonished to find, without him knowing it, all his books have been translated into Chinese illegally. And he had already 30,000 followers in China. He went on to suggest that he thinks China will overtake India in yoga as well. He probably hasn't heard of Swami Ramdev. I'm not sure he's on the ball there, but never mind. Finally, I know I'm running out short of time, but I do just want to focus a little bit on business, if I might. I think China, like everybody else, really wants to do business in India. But the problem is they find it a hassle, they find it, it's too difficult, and they're just looking for a way to do it. It's very significant to me that they invited Narendra Modi, the Chief Minister of Gujarat, who is economically a very dynamic administrator. They invited him to China. He enthusiastically accepted. He gave them a talk on the Chinese link, the links between China and Gujarat. Going back to the Buddhist times, he promised to build the biggest Buddhist stupa in the world in Gujarat. He went on this trip in December. It was a huge success. He went with 20 businessmen. He came back with an armful of contracts, which he's busy implementing. So I think it's trying to happen. I mean, India is trying to attract China into its road sector. It's going to spend 70 billion or whatever the next 5 years. Most of it is going to come from the private sector. I think China's involvement in infrastructure is going to ramp up. It has spare capacity in this area. Chinese spending is winding down in this area. India's is going up. It has the expertise, it has the spare capacity, and India is one of the places they should be looking at. There are 100 companies, Chinese companies in India, companies like Huawei. Huawei employs 6,000 people in India, and it quotes Mahatma Gandhi on its website. You have a look at it. And Indian companies are also expanding rapidly. So these things are happening, and I think as these things happen, particularly popular culture, as it spreads, as people-to-people contacts improve, the gap will narrow. So I should stop there. I want to say that. Thank you.